Hello, hello, welcome everyone. Especially welcome to anyone for whom this is the first Oxford Psychedelic Society event. My name is Eddie Jacobs, I'm the science officer here, and I'm thrilled to start this, our first event of the year. Sadly, we can't welcome you in person, but we've got a special treat in store for you to make up for that. So our speaker tonight is Dr. James Cooke. So he's a neuroscientist at UCL. But to just call him that would be to be selling him short massively. So James is, I think, a real asset to the psychedelic space and definitely someone that we should all be watching in the next few years. So he's an Oxford-trained neuroscientist, but as you will come to realise over the course of this talk, he is also deeply spiritually engaged. And I think this is extremely important for the study of the psychedelic experience because anyone that goes into trying to understand what's going on here from a single disciplinary background is necessarily going to come out with a completely impoverished worldview. So outside of his work at UCL, James hosts a fantastic YouTube channel, which is helpfully just titled, I think, Dr. James Cooke. And it was watching these few of these videos here, which made me think we need to get this guy on to talk at OPS because he understands like quite clearly lots of concepts in Eastern spirituality, lots of concepts in neuroscience. So there are loads of things surrounding the psychedelic experience. You'll hear people say things like, well, really the self is illusion, or really what we are is the universe experiencing itself. And these make us feel good and warm and fuzzy and countercultural. But James, I think, has a real knack for making these claims completely accessible in neurobiological terms, and you don't need a neuroscience degree to understand it. In more recent months, James's podcast, Living Mirrors, he started interviewing the great and the good of like a whole host of disciplines. So his recent guests have been Robert Wright, who wrote this phenomenal book, Why Buddhism is True, which should be on all your reading lists. Bill Richards, who heads up the mystical experiences research at Johns Hopkins University. Dennis McKenna, who kind of needs no introduction. Gail Bradbrook of Extinction Rebellion, and Christoph Koch, who is one of the great luminaries of consciousness research. Yes, so tonight James is going to be talking to us about the psychedelic experience and consciousness. His academic work on consciousness has, at this stage, sort of culminated in him proposing what he calls the living mirror theory of consciousnly. And there's a freely available PDF of that on his website. It's about 18 pages and it's really great. Like you can just tell that James knows his neuroscience and also that he is steeped in understanding of spirituality and Eastern philosophy. And so how we can't really understand entities in the absence of understanding the context that they're in. And I think calling his theory the living mirror is possibly like a wink to Chan Buddhism or Zen Buddhism that really talks about conscious experience or being as a mirror. I think that's enough hype. So what James is going to talk for about an hour. If you could keep muted for the course of that hour, maybe type up any questions that you have as we're going along. And then when we're done, we can go through the questions and we will unmute you one at a time so you can ask any questions personally. And yes, just before I hand over to James, I will come out with my begging bowl to say our running costs are quite modest, but they are not zero. So if you enjoy this event, it would be wonderful if you could throw £1, £2, maybe even £3 our way. Someone on the committee will be, perfect. Yeah, it's just in the chat now. All right, everybody, Dr. James Cooke.
Great, thanks so much. That was a wonderful introduction. Could listen to that all evening. Okay, I'll try sharing my screen.
Sorry, I also accidentally just turned your video off, thinking it was my video. There you go.
Great. Yeah, it'd be a shame if after that hype we failed at basic technical stuff. Okay, is that all looking good? Great, I'll assume yes. Why is it doing that? Okay, so yeah, thanks a lot. Thanks for having me. It's a pleasure to be the first speaker of the term. I used to organize kind of neuroscience seminar series back when I was doing my PhD in Oxford, and it was one of the real highlights of my time there. So I love what you guys are doing. Yeah, and I think I came across you guys at the, what was that? There was like a psychedelic festival last year that I went to, and yeah,
Oddball.
you guys are doing really. That's the one, Oddball. Yeah, yeah. I keep meaning to get one of your kind of t-shirts, which I will at some point. Okay, so psychedelics, reality and consciousness. So to begin with, this is going to be very zoomed out. I'm going to try and assume no knowledge of these topics and try and kind of, yeah, give an overview of the relevant things. So to begin with, consciousness and reality are related because, as kind of concepts, because fundamentally we find ourselves here having these kinds of experiences, these kinds of first-person experiences. There's an appearance of a world, you seem to be situated in it, there seem to be people and objects and all these things happening. And if your development has gone kind of appropriately, you will come to just kind of accept the world as kind of self-evident, as existing around you. But if you stop and reflect on it, you can realize that all you ever know directly is your own consciousness. This is a kind of conscious experience, what's happening in front of you right now, and as illustrated in the picture. And so if you really kind of grapple with that, you know, this is really summed up well by Descartes and the kind of I think, therefore I am idea. You could be in a dream, you could be in the matrix, a whole manner of things could be happening that could be making you detached from the kind of ground of reality, but you do know that you're having an experience. Something seems to be happening. And so consciousness, we know exists. We don't really know for certain that anything else does. So this is why you get kind of, to ask questions about consciousness is to ask questions about reality and vice versa. But most of us, as we go about our lives, we come to feel that there is a kind of external world, an objective physical world that exists outside of us. And we build up this kind of intuitive feeling, typically, that we exist, we have an identity, a self, something that exists inside our heads. So, you know, I feel like as James, I'm situated somewhere up here. People have done experiments on this, kind of showing that if you hold something close to someone's knee, they'll say it's further away from them than if you hold it the same distance from their head. So, you know, it's fairly uncontroversial to say that in general, people feel like they have this kind of identity that exists inside their head. And so this is our kind of folk psychology. And we feel like we're truly separate from this physical world around us. And this self inside the head has experiences. So here you have this kind of, this self that's viewing the kind of contents of the mind. And so this is how kind of we intuitively, a lot of people have intuitively thought about consciousness and the associated picture of reality. And we live in a time now where, for a lot of kind of human history, we were kind of stuck with contemplation, contemplating our own experience, philosophizing about it. But now we also have these third-person tools of neuroscience, psychology, just science in general. And I think the only way we can really come to conclusions about the nature of consciousness and reality is to use both of these. We really need to engage with the kind of nature of experience, but I do think there's value in bringing science to bear on this as well. So because this is, you know, there's been a taboo for a long time in Western science about bringing first-person subjective experience into science because it's not, you know, as readily quantifiable as third-person aspects. You know, kind of like running experiments on the physical world is better suited to science than me reporting what's going on subjectively. But I'm arguing that we need to reflect on the validity of spiritual experiences, a whole range of subjective experiences. So full disclosure of my own biases and my own kind of worldview and perspective, I thought I would start with a kind of short story about why I'm here today, effectively, why I studied what I studied in the past, why I study it now. And so when I was 13, I was going to school in this town, Colchester in Essex, and I was passing this castle on the bus. And it was a Catholic school, and I was kind of overly conscientious. I was stressing about the prospect of going to hell. And I didn't have blind faith. Even back then, I was a very kind of science-minded, kind of rationalistic kid. And I couldn't magic up this blind faith, but I was told that there was a benevolent God who had made me exactly the way I was, without blind faith, yet was demanding I had it, that I had to have it. Otherwise, I'd be tortured for infinity. And I was taking this very seriously, getting very stressed about it. And eventually, I think because there was no solution and it was exerting such an emotional toll, it was so stressful, my mind just kind of, my thinking mind, the kind of language, the words, the ideas, they just kind of ground to a halt. And I can't really show you an image of what happened next because nothing really changed kind of visibly. I didn't have any hallucinations or anything. But there was this profound perspective shift where I suddenly found myself in the present moment, just kind of seeing what I had been seeing the moment before, but my mind had gone silent. And there was just this sense of complete bliss, freedom from suffering, a sense of the past and the future being revealed to just be kind of illusions of thought, and the present moment to be really being all that really truly exists, and a real just kind of confrontation with existence in the present moment, and realizing that reality is beyond what we say about it. It's beyond our ideas. And in that moment, I kind of, funnily enough, this spiritual experience kind of converted me to atheism, you could say. You know, you have debates about whether naturalistic kind of spirituality would make you an atheist. But from the idea of like kind of Christian, you know, parental God, from that day on, I never worried about it for a second longer because I felt intuitively that those were just words, ideas, things I'd been told. And what was real was experience, and was even beyond experience was just the fact of being, which is beyond what you say about it. And this is something that's really attested to in the psychedelic experience. Aldous Huxley wrote about, very kind of ahead of his time, this idea that the brain evolved basically to take us away from these moments of being kind of completely satisfied in the present moment. And instead of feeling, so what I felt there was a sense of everything that exists and is therefore just part of this one thing of existence. So this was a kind of unitive state where I felt like I was the same as everything else. There's this like collapsing of a feeling of separation from the rest of the world. And I understand that now to be mediated through concepts, ideas, thoughts. And so, as Aldous Huxley said, you've got, I mean, I think the little window is blocking some of this quote, so I won't read it. But the idea is that if you take your concepts too seriously and you think these abstractions are real, you know, that's the way that you go. That's the way into suffering, delusion, confusion about what's actually happening. And so this is what I see the value of things like meditation, as well as insights you can have with psychedelics, in bringing you closer to what you could call the non-conceptual nature of reality. The fact it just is beyond the concepts and words you use to describe it. Oops. Okay. So then I thought I'd throw this in because this is the Oxford Psychedelic Society. I went to St Anne's College, Oxford, studied experimental psychology in this beautiful building. And then it was there that I learned about the brain, and I kind of intellectually fell in love with the cerebral cortex, this kind of wrinkly outer structure of the brain, and became fascinated as to how it is it pulls off this trick of making us think that instead of living in this unified single reality where there is no suffering, it seemingly evolved to make us feel like we live in a world of separate objects, and we're a separate object that needs to be really concerned with its own survival and its own issues. So I almost understood this to be kind of like trying to understand the enemy to some extent, to how we'd got to this situation where, yeah, we're living in a state of delusion, I guess is how I still see it. And I was exposed to these ideas. You know, this was around the time when kind of artificial intelligence was really having this boom that is still going on, and that was understood to arise out of the kind of network structure of the brain. And so I became interested in how it is that these kind of networks of brain cells put up concepts. I went to do a PhD, moved to Worcester College because they have a nice lake and pretty gardens, and then to the physiology department to do a neuroscience degree, master's and DPhil / PhD. Yeah, and so I studied perception there. Now I'm based between University College London and Trinity College Dublin. I have research positions in both places now. So very, very briefly, this may not even be worth going into, so it will be very brief. You can do experiments looking at how sensory experience, your kind of conscious experience, gets structured into concepts. If you take different vowels or phonemes, which is kind of speech sounds like ba versus da, but you can do it with vowels as well, and you use a computer to morph between them, even though you do a kind of a linear change of the physical sound, perception tends to collapse into categories. And so your perception isn't of the actual objectively true stimulus, it's of your learned concepts. And then when you can play around with these sounds, and what you find is sound space is chunked up into these concepts. You don't hear, unlike blending blue and green and getting a kind of greenish blue, if I morph between I and E, you don't hear something midway between an I and an E, you get this kind of collapsing into concepts. So this is the kind of a lot of the research that I've been doing, and will be relevant for later when I'm kind of talking about how I understand psychedelic experiences. So a final point on this, one way of thinking about how networks of neurons perform this kind of generating concepts and categories, recognizing written digits for a long time is a very difficult problem. How do you differentiate this 3 from an 8 when some of the 8s, have bits that don't close, and there's no kind of simple feature you can use, simple algorithm you can write to categorize these. But if you feed them into a network of simulated neurons, let's see if this works. Maybe this video is not going to work. Oh no, here we go. So this is just a simulation of a bunch of spiking neurons that are trained to take in a bunch of pixels and categorize, there's sound. And to categorize, I'm assuming you can still hear me even though I've muted that. Let's mute it there. So it lights up on these boxes when it categorizes the pixel, and through the kind of dynamics of these networks of neurons, you can get this kind of extraction of categories from these very complex inputs. So this is the kind of thing I was interested in understanding, how this kind of thing happens in the brain. Okay, and so when you do that and you have networks of neurons, what you find is if you train them to recognize something like faces, they'll first recognize edges, simple shapes like curves, then up to more complex shapes, which are kind of combinations of these features, all the way up to very complex features like whole faces. And so you can think of the brain as extracting patterns in reality. You could call them statistical regularities, is another way we talk about it. But effectively, it's taking patterns and embedding them in this network so that it can use it for recognition. And when you run that process in reverse, that's a way of thinking about what hallucination is. So yeah, this is kind of what I said. In the brain, you've got these kind of, this is in vision, these visual areas, you go from simple to complex features. And so I was really interested in studying the cortex, which has this structured into these kinds of columns with all these different types of brain cells. And the fascinating thing is they all have roughly the same kind of connectivity. There seems to be a circuit motif that repeats. And so people have done this kind of work I do, trying to figure out what is the kind of computational unit of the cortex that allows it to structure experience in this way. All right, I will go into psychedelics now. So we know that psychedelics like psilocybin bind to the 5-HT2A receptor, which is found on some of these neurons in the cortex, specifically around here in the kind of deep layers. This is where your skull would be, and this is the inside. And we know they profoundly alter your perception and these kind of processes of perceptual categorization. This is a slice of mouse brain where in red you can see where these 5-HT2A receptors are, the ones activated by psychedelics. And you can see they're widespread in the cortex. So it only kind of follows that, I guess, for me, psychedelics are a really powerful way of thinking about perception and how normal perception functions, but also how these kinds of different states in psychedelics affect normal cortical processing. So yeah, we know that if you take certain substances, the categories start to kind of fall apart. Classic kind of visuals of melting is something reported widely with things like LSD. So it seems to be interfering with this process that I've been talking about of layering concepts onto reality. And so maybe you can see here how it's kind of circling back on this initial kind of spiritual experience I had of realizing that our concepts aren't real. Our concepts are kind of these ideas that we overlay on reality. And so with a high enough dose, you can have all of your concepts dissolve into a single unitive mess experientially, and this can produce profound insights into kind of certain features of the nature of reality. And I mean, that's effectively one of the main claims of this talk, so I'll unpack that in more detail. But certain substances and certain doses produce, instead of a kind of something that seems to deconstruct your experience of the world, merge the content, you can also have these visionary experiences of profoundly structured, complex experiences with entities and different realms and all of this stuff that feels incredibly real. So what I kind of wanted to do in this talk was basically argue that I think the mystical experience, the unitive experience, provides genuine insight into the nature of reality and consciousness. Although I think you need to return to science to really pin down the consciousness part. But I think the visionary experience shouldn't be interpreted as literally true. There's a lot of people in the psychedelic space who I think ascribe to the idea of them being literally true. So if you're someone who's way over on the science side and thinks it's absurd to even entertain it if you're like a hardcore, physicalist, then I just know that this is a genuine discussion going on in the community. It's not I'm not kind of straw manning people's positions. Okay. And yeah, so it is a serious consideration because of this issue that no matter how much science proceeds, no matter how much this game of material science seems to work, you can never know you're not about to wake up from the dream. You really do ultimately just have this problem of you don't know that you're not the only mind in existence. It's not going to wake up 2 seconds from now into a different reality. So there is a kind of these visionary states aren't as easily dismissible as one might think they are. Okay, so psychedelics. For anyone could use a reminder or isn't familiar with these kind of classical core psychedelics, these are the ones that act primarily on that serotonin 5-HT2A receptor. So you have LSD, psilocybin, and dimethyltryptamine or DMT. LSD is obviously associated with the 60s. Psilocybin's got a lot of association with contemporary clinical work. And DMT, people mainly know as one of the active compounds in ayahuasca. And if we go the other way, the way I like to think about it is DMT is a kind of naturally occurring psychedelic that occurs in our own bodies. So you can think of that as serving some kind of natural endogenous function within us. Psilocybin you can think of as a kind of a version of DMT that the natural world has stumbled across that may have some evolutionary benefit, but that acts on the same kind of pathways as DMT. And LSD is semi-synthetic. It does occur naturally in the ergot fungus, but to get LSD as we know it, you have to extract it in a lab. So we're kind of moving away, is how I think about it, from the kind of the classical, I guess, the kind of the core natural psychedelic, which I would think of as DMT. LSD in the 60s had this association with Eastern religion, Eastern spirituality, as Eddie mentioned. That there's this ongoing association between these areas, specifically kind of Hinduism and Buddhism and Taoism. So does psilocybin, but it wasn't as popular in the 60s. And similarly, this is because they both produce these kinds of mystical unitive experiences very readily. DMT, on the other hand, while it can produce these experiences, especially in its kind of pure state, is known to produce these strange visionary experiences where there is no collapsing of self and other. You don't have a sense that you are unified with the rest of reality. Instead, you feel like you remain a separate identity, but you're engaging with seemingly autonomous entities in a seemingly other realm, dimension, whatever words you want to use for it. So you can kind of crudely split these into these two kind of experiences. I should say DMT-like experiences are very common on high doses of psilocybin as well. So this is extreme simplification, but you can think of these mystical unitive, one with the universe experiences, and these kinds of experiences seemingly of kind of non-physical realms. And I'll kind of talk about this later, but I kind of think of this as a kind of I think of the one with the universe experience as a kind of naturalistic spirituality that fits with contemporary science's picture of the world, whereas the experiences of non-physical realms feels like a more literal, maybe traditional spirituality where there's like a belief in genuine spirits. I won't read this either, but this is a famous quote from William James, so I thought I should argue why it's reasonable to think that states induced by altered states induced by chemicals could be of any value in understanding reality. And the kind of core idea, I would argue, kind of after William James, who experimented with nitrous oxide and these kind of altered states, he felt that what we call kind of, as he said, normal waking consciousness, rational consciousness, that's just one type of consciousness. I'm reading it now, but it's not necessarily more true, more adaptive. Well, you can think of it probably as more adaptive evolutionarily. But the point is that there are other states of consciousness, and as he says, probably have their own adaptation or application. They're not just pure distortions. They can have value. And he also made this point of the link between consciousness and reality, that we really can't say we've understood reality if we don't understand all these diverse states of consciousness. Dennis McKenna as well, who, as already mentioned, is fond of making this point that we are made of drugs, and that all experience is mediated through the kinds of chemicals that produce these altered states, similar chemicals. So there is no neat kind of boundary between being sober and seeing the world accurately and being intoxicated, and that's not, I would say, a useful way to think about this. And finally, I hinted at this earlier, evolution didn't, it's kind of widely accepted now that evolution didn't, natural selection isn't interested in shaping us to see objective truth. It shapes us to see things that are good for our survival. You call these fitness payoffs. So are flowers objectively beautiful? They're attractive to bees, but we understand the evolutionary dynamics that led to that mutually beneficial arrangement with bees carrying pollen. And so the attraction is in the dynamics of the interaction and the perception of the bee, and similar dynamics with humans being attracted to flowers. It's not actually in the flower. There is no kind of essence of beauty in the flower. And a related idea, I apologize for the next slide. It's intended to be kind of disgusting, so close your eyes if you don't want to see some rotting meat. But rotting meat is something that we find objectively disgusting, but these maggots seem to be having a kind of field day. For them, it seems to be deeply attractive. And if they have conscious states, then presumably there's a sense of pleasure or at least attraction to this. I'll move on from that. So this is to make the point that our usual perceptions of the world aren't objective truths. They're useful fictions that we tell about the world in order to help us navigate it. So that opens the possibility that we can learn things. If our usual state of consciousness is in some sense deluded, by dissolving it, we may learn something. And so that's what I think happens in the mystical experience. You disrupt this process of perceptual categorization, your concepts break down, and if you have very strict ideas about what different objects are, and then suddenly your perception of it is distorted and breaks down, you can get insights into deep principles of both the mind and reality. And it's not that if everything starts melting, you take the content to be literally true and think, well, actually, the world is a melting world, but it's more that in the patterns you can apprehend kind of certain truths about the mind and reality. And so this happens with concepts, with objects in your everyday kind of environment, but it also happens with your sense of self, which is a kind of splitting yourself off as an object from the rest of the world, instead of seeing yourself as a kind of pattern in a greater whole, which can happen with kind of ego dissolution states with psychedelics. You see yourself in the sober state typically as separate and as existing inside this truly separate organism. So you can have these blissful states of relief of suffering. This is where kind of Buddhist philosophy is very helpful in understanding how these evolutionary dynamics, Robert Wright's book was already mentioned, makes this connection between the kind of craving that gets built into us through evolution and the wisdom of Buddhism, that it's that craving that produces suffering. And you can be given what feels like a more objective view of reality where your kind of petty self-concerns are truly petty self-concerns. They're not objective truths about the world. It's not actually the be-all and end-all of existence that I'm going to die. You know, you've evolved to really care about your own survival, but it's not objectively a big deal. So yeah, I also mentioned that this is, I think, why a lot of people find meditation to be a useful way to kind of integrate these experiences and re-engage with this terrain, because you're kind of suspending or practicing suspending perceptual thought. So when it comes to the way that the kind of cortical machinery I was talking about earlier gets disrupted, there's still a huge number of open questions. At the level of the kind of circuitry, we really know very little. But at the scale of the whole brain, we have, you know, these lovely studies now seeing decreases in brain activity in certain kind of key network hubs after psilocybin in this case. I won't unpack this at the moment, but we also have good theoretical work in line with what I've been saying, that beliefs about the world, instead of believing, or, you know, if you think of holding onto a belief of a concept very tightly, psychedelics seem to relax how tightly we hold on to those beliefs. This is one model from Robin Carr Harris and Carl Friston, who basically cast what I've been describing in a hierarchical way, and they say that psychedelics kind of knock out the top parts of the hierarchy that keep everything under control. But that's probably for another talk. And then you get these kind of mystical unitive states when you dissolve these, how strongly you hold on to these beliefs. Okay, so how can this tell us anything interesting about consciousness? I've been arguing that it can tell us something interesting about reality, because, you know, I think if you think about what a physicist might say about reality, there's no physics of explaining the individual objects that you perceive in your environment. There's no physics of beauty or of glasses or, you know, tables. From the perspective of physics, you have this whole system, this one system of reality that you're trying to kind of map and understand its lawful nature. And I think these mystical experiences just kind of show you that kind of perspective where you see everything just as this one unfolding process. And so where does consciousness fit into that? For a lot of people, you have this sense of the unity of the world. Consciousness continues to exist. And so there can be a temptation to take what's called an idealist ontology, like a view of the world where only consciousness exists, which isn't the line I take. But I think you can, in this picture, you can still have separate islands of consciousness emerging, but the whole of reality is still a unified whole. And I'm going to have to, so there's a lot of material here I'm going to be skimming over, but yeah, hopefully it's of interest. A way of thinking about this is to understand the emergence of life as a kind of holistic systems phenomenon, where an organism is a pattern in reality that propels itself forward, keeps its form together in a universe that's dissolving. This is the second law of thermodynamics, that everything moves towards this kind of this mixed soup of just thermodynamic equilibrium. But organisms manage to take in energy and keep their pattern together over time. And so I think there are organisms, there are separate, there are patterns that, I shouldn't say separate, there are patterns that try to separate themselves off in a sense and keep their form together. But the psychological self that dissolves with high doses of psychedelic, isn't that organism. The organism doesn't dissolve, but the idea of the organism does. So the organism in its mind, you know, right now I have this concept of James that gets mapped onto not only my physical body, but also my possessions, my likes, my history, my future plans. It's this very kind of, it's a completely psychological thing, sense of self. And what you can be confronted with is that even though the organism does exist, the self, the psychological self that we feel we are, is an idea, and you can do without it. The lights don't go out, experience continues. And so the idea of being this little person inside your head who has experiences, that goes away. And you can see yourself to be like a wave in the greater whole, to be a self-organizing system that's just one aspect of this bigger reality that, for whatever reason, and I have my own speculation of what that reason is, for whatever reason is associated with consciousness, but that consciousness is a feature of the interplay between the environment and the organism is not a feature of the truly separate brain in the truly separate organism that suddenly becomes conscious. It emerges as a systems emergent feature of the whole of reality. And so this experience can also make people open to the idea of plant consciousness. This is kind of anecdotal at this point. I don't know of any published data kind of quantifying this, but anecdotally, you see a lot of people who, after psychedelic experiences, feel like if they have states of ego dissolution, but they realize the lights don't go out and they still have awareness, they can realize that consciousness is absolutely the kind of thing a plant could have, as it's just sensation. It doesn't require a complex nervous system that can manipulate complex symbols and have abstract thought. Because consciousness is just experience. Maybe I should have defined that at the start, but it's just, yeah, experience or awareness. And so the kinds of aspects of reality that we can take away from these kinds of mystical experiences of ego dissolution, there are three, in Theravada Buddhism, there are these three kind of marks of existence, which I think are quite useful in understanding this. You have impermanence, the fact that existence and the mind consists of a constant flow, a constant process. There really is no ground, no place to stand. The flow is really the only ground you can find. And so there's also the concept of not self, the idea that self isn't what you think it is, it's some kind of idea rather than a solid thing, which is tied up with impermanence. There are some traditions in Vipassana meditation where you basically focus on impermanence until you get the idea that there's nothing here that could be a self, that could exist over time in a solid sense. And as I mentioned, there's also the fact that suffering arises because of your constant grasping onto solidity, which is, you know, an understandable evolved trait, but it doesn't have to be there. So for us, this is a mark of existence, the suffering. So these ideas come out of the red part here. This is where Theravada Buddhism is associated with. But I've been very influenced by what's called Mahayana Buddhism, which is the kind of, as it spread north into China, Tibet, Japan, Korea. And they have this concept of emptiness, which is very emphasized, which I take to be very related to what I was talking about earlier of reality not being made of concepts, not really being made of, you know, my microphone, I feel like it has essence of microphone, but it actually doesn't. It's just part of this whole process. And if you try to find a stable essence there, you won't be able to. It's empty of any essence because it's just part of a process. And I put this here because I think that encapsulates the idea of the self being an illusion. If you understand that everything is just this process and empty of essence, the self is also empty of any real stable essence. So these are the kinds of things I think, the kind of insights you can have about the nature of reality that are valid, that, you know, people can come to these conclusions and often do independently with psychedelic experiences, and I think they are legitimate and valid and stand up to comparison with a Western kind of worldview, both in terms of, you know, compare impermanence to a kind of thermodynamic understanding of the world, and it matches up nicely. The idea of not self to neuroscience and psychology, and emptiness to the kind of the experiments idea around concepts, craving from evolution. It all kind of fits with a modern Western worldview. But so I hinted earlier that for a lot of people, if we think about this issue of consciousness and reality with the unit of experience, the simplest thing to say would be, given that all I know is my consciousness, you might want to think that all of reality is consciousness. And you can never know this mysterious process of whether you call it matter or whatever, the stuff that's outside of consciousness, you can never know directly. So a lot of people, both in on the left here is a representation of a kind of Hindu metaphysics where reality consists of a supreme self, a supreme being that is kind of synonymous with consciousness, that is the kind of force of creation in the world. And on the right, we have Bishop Berkeley in the West, who had similar ideas about all of existence being consciousness. This is an idea that's got a lot of popularity in the psychedelic space, understandably. I personally think just because you can't know the stuff outside of consciousness directly, it doesn't mean it doesn't exist. You can easily confuse what, you know, those issues of what you can know and what could be real, which is why I'm a big fan of bringing science to bear, because I think things fit together more nicely when you make certain assumptions about there being a material world that exists outside of my consciousness and start to do science with these things. So my picture of reality isn't that everything is consciousness, but it's that it is the strange process that's mapped by physics and we study with science. And it's this, I don't think, and I think a lot of physicists and scientists would agree, that matter isn't hard stuff, but it's some mysterious process that can be quantified and mapped. But the important thing is that you can call that process whatever you want. You can call it matter, you can call it consciousness, but ultimately, if you're saying all of reality is X, that's kind of a meaningless statement, because language is this like relativistic framework of ideas where everything is cashed out against everything else. So it really doesn't mean anything to call it anything. And this is tied up with the idea of it being non-conceptual. This may be going a bit deep now, but so this is just to say that I think beyond our individual islands of consciousness, there is a reality. And as I mentioned before, I won't labor the point, but it's not the same as ideas about it. So Bill Richards, who was also mentioned when he had his first psilocybin experience, he wrote down in German, reality is, which I think nicely sums up this feeling of reality just existing beyond what you say about it. There's a Zen saying of don't mistake the finger pointing at the moon for the moon, which is, again, your symbols, your communicative strategies are not the same thing as reality. I'm a big fan of the way this is understood in Taoism. The Tao that can be told is not the eternal Tao. Tao is, you can think of as this kind of process of reality. And yeah, if you call it the Tao or the process or the totality of what exists, and you think you've encompassed it, you've really not. And if you've not had these experiences of realizing the limitations of concepts, it may be hard to kind of intuitively get why I'm saying this, what's the problem of giving it a name. But by definition, you can't really put this into words. But in the West, you also have Alfred North Whitehead, who made the same point about mistaking abstractions for the thing in itself. And artists like Claude Monet as well, saying we must forget the name of the thing we are looking at. I think that's clipped off. I think it was in order to see it clearly. Yeah, that's half a quote. Okay, so in my work, I've argued that you do have this unitive whole of reality. And I think that conscious systems are parts of that reality, processes in that reality, systems that keep their form together, as I said about life earlier. And I think there's reason to believe that, or at least I've been arguing that I think the key to understanding where mind and consciousness emerges is in the dynamics of propagating one's form through time. I won't go into this here, but the crucial point is that you can have this unitive picture of reality, and you can see consciousness emerging as these little islands that come into existence as this dance between the organism and its environment that aren't truly separate, instead of the image of a truly separate organism with a truly separate brain that has to somehow have its symbols of the outside world illuminated by consciousness. Yeah, so that's the other way of thinking about it. This image I just kind of like is how I think about the kind of living systems as these enclosed structures that reflections, a bit of a kind of an analogy for how patterns in the external world get instantiated inside the system as conscious experiences. Won't go into that now. But yeah, in the same way that galaxies and things form in this single unified whole, I see islands of consciousness emerging. It doesn't mean that the reality isn't a unified whole. So in this picture, I'm arguing we didn't evolve to see reality clearly, and so dissolving our concepts can really give us insight into the nature of reality beyond our kind of deluded way we usually see reality. When it comes to consciousness, psychedelic experiences can show us that your experience really isn't dependent on the self, and that's the psychological self. And that's something that really can be cashed out experientially. You don't really need science to prove that. Once you experience it, it's evident. But then I think science is really useful to come in when we try to think about these questions of, well, where does consciousness emerge in this picture? I don't think with contemplation alone you can really figure that out. Yeah, I've skipped over here that you can perceive certain kind of fundamental truths about the universe, that it's a reality, that it's unitive, impermanent, non-conceptual. Yeah, okay, so I think that's some of the mystical experience stuff. Okay, am I on track? I think so. So this is part 2. So what I've been talking about so far, I see as a kind of naturalistic spirituality that fits with science, doesn't require any supernatural beliefs or any restructuring of our current paradigm. There's a movement at the moment, you can find lots of podcasts. Apparently there are multiple podcasts called Secular Buddhism, and books, as was mentioned, Robert Wright's book, arguing this kind of thing. So, but on the other hand, you have, as I alluded to earlier, maybe a more traditional or literal spirituality. If you're a scientist and you say you find spirituality valuable to someone who doesn't know what meditation is or takes no interest in this stuff, my instinct from those conversations is people map it onto a kind of, oh, you believe in spirits, ghosts who are petitionable, some kind of disembodied realm, which is not. So this is what I'm referring to when I say spirituality, but you do also have these experiences which are so common as to be, I would say, a real part of the human experience. I think it's been a really neglected area that, shamanism all over the world, engaging with spirits is a real experiential phenomenon that needs to be fitted, it needs to fit it into our picture of the world. So visionary experiences, as I mentioned, you can think of these as different to mystical experiences because you still have your sense of self and of inhabiting a world that's separate to you. You may perceive gods, spirits, angels, aliens. In the West, there's been this, in religious studies, there's been a kind of split in the public eye, this kind of idea of, even though there's a mix of visionary and mystical experiences in all religious traditions, there's this general kind of thinking in the West that Eastern religions emphasize mysticism, Western religions emphasize kind of visionary revelation, which isn't entirely misplaced. Moses' burning bush, Moses didn't dissolve into it. There's this, God is speaking to him from this vision. Western kind of literature is littered with these kind of things. Shamanism throughout the world, as I mentioned, engaging with spirit worlds, often, in a way that seems to take them to be literally autonomous and real in some sense, in that you might be trying to get them to do something to achieve some goal in the physical world, or give you information, or all this kind of stuff. Ayahuasca, a lot of people, is very, very common, again, anecdotally, but it's very common for people to have their worldview changed after ayahuasca experiences, of particularly this particular experience of a being that people call Mother Ayahuasca. There seems to be an autonomous, intelligent being. In my own experiences, it's utterly convincing. It doesn't feel like a dream or something vague, and it feels like as real as talking to, maybe more real than talking to people on Zoom. And the pure DMT experience is a very strange experience, typically of very kind of fast-paced, manic encounters with these often loving entities that can manifest as kind of jesters and elves, but sometimes aliens and insects and kind of reptilian aliens. And so there's a whole range of these kinds of visionary experiences that need to be accounted for. And some people account for them by saying what we take to be reality is one very small part of the world, and there really are these other places experientially you can go to. I take the line that these are coming from the human mind, but I do think there's a real challenge here as to why such a simple molecule like DMT, which is incredibly simple, very related to serotonin, would produce experiences of jesters. That's a very striking, odd phenomenon as far as I can see. So going into this topic of what we can think, what visionary experiences might tell us about consciousness and reality, when psychedelic research kind of wrapped up in the 60s and 70s, when it was revived, the first experiments were with DMT. So Rick Strassman did these experiments where he went into it as a Zen Buddhist with the same kind of worldview I've been outlining so far. He had this kind of naturalistic spirituality about kind of union with this reality that's beyond concepts. And his participants had these wacky, strange experiences of other realms and entities. And it unnerved him enough that he stopped the studies but wrote this book, DMT, the Spirit Molecule, which made into a documentary. And yeah, it was an important part of the psychedelic renaissance before it kind of really properly kicked off. So people, again, just so you don't think I'm straw manning the kind of, or claiming that people take this stuff literally when they don't. Rick Strassman went on to write this other book, DMT and the Soul of Prophecy, where he kind of, this is his account where his worldview changed from the kind of scientific, naturalistic spirituality based in Zen Buddhism through to rediscovering his Judaism and believing in a world in which, so he coined this term theoneurology, instead of neurotheology, which is the kind of study of how brain states produce religious experiences. He was arguing that we live in a world, we live in the kind of world of the God of Abraham, where there is this God that you can engage with, and that God has engineered our brains to be sensitive to DMT so that we can have these visionary experiences with this genuine God that literally exists. Needless to say, kind of radical departure from mainstream scientific thinking. And recently you have Andrew Gallimore, who's a computational neuroscientist, who published this book, Alien Information Theory, arguing or outlining a kind of worldview in which we might be in some kind of simulation created by entities, and DMT is a way to basically shift dimensions into this higher dimensional plane and engage with these entities. So people are out there arguing that the DMT experience precipitates radically different, a strong change in the conception of reality and consciousness, because consciousness is tied up with this because it's the medium through which you have these experiences. This is a popular common representation by the artist Alex Gray of what the DMT experience is like. There's a kind of, with pure DMT, an utter replacement of this reality with a reality like this. Lots of eyes everywhere is very, very common. Faces, humanoid beings, kind of endless geometric kind of patterns like this. There's a tendency, or there has been a tendency in the past, I think, for artists to take some liberty with making it have more gravitas than it often does. Because in my experience, these are far more better capture the kind of wacky weirdness of the experience. Again, eyes absolutely everywhere. These kinds of geometric patterns and these kinds of entities just kind of observing you and engaging with you. So these experiences, Chris Timmerman, who studies DMT at the Imperial Research Group, published a paper showing that the experience mirrors the near-death experience quite nicely. So near-death experiences are actually surprisingly common. I think it was either out-of-body or near-death experiences about 10% of people report having, which I was surprised by. So I now think this is also a phenomenon that needs accounting for. In my earlier years, I probably would have been fairly quick to just say some people are going to have weird experiences and they're not really of interest. But now I think this reflects something important. My presumption is about the mind. Other people's presumption is about the nature of reality. This is a very popular kind of best-selling book about a neurosurgeon who had the near-death experience, very similar to DMT, feeling like you go down a tunnel and come out in some world full of loving entities that are paying attention to you and telling you basically about the nature of reality. And so I see these as kind of subcategories of out-of-body experiences. People have these, not when they're near death, just some people can do it at will. They claim experiences of kind of one's self, one's consciousness, one's identity, this kind of self in the head, becoming decoupled from the physical body and then being able to physically move around the room and people take this to be really convincing subjective evidence that there is this decoupling of consciousness and the physical world. In my picture of the world, consciousness is completely embedded in the process. It's a process that's associated with the physical process of life, so there is no room for this kind of thing to be literally true. I just really like this as this image, so I thought I'd put this in. So this worldview is maybe most closely associated with Descartes in the West, who had this kind of dualistic worldview of consciousness, this substance he called res cogitans, the kind of thinking substance, and res extensa, the extended substance, which is the stuff that physical stuff is made of. And he had, this very sophisticated, ahead of its time view of the body as a kind of mechanical machine, kind of that relays information. he thought these were animal spirits, but this is very similar to our understanding of nerves these days, how they relay sensory signals. And he thought the interface between the physical body and consciousness was the pineal gland. And that this is pineal gland. I think he probably chose it, a lot of people think he probably chose it because most structures in the brain are mirrored. There are two of them. Pineal gland, there's only one that's right in the middle. So it's quite striking. There's this, if there were to be a central node of the brain, you would think it was that. Mainstream neuroscience thinks it's mainly just to do with sleep and things these days, produces melatonin. So we're back to this issue of consciousness and reality. You have dualism, the idea that you have these two separate substances. And then I would say that in contemporary Western thinking, you don't see many dualists arguing for dualism these days. I think it's fair to say that most people might agree that in philosophy and science that there are some fundamental problems with it. If you have these two fundamentally separate substances that obey their own laws, yet they interact, there's a kind of a paradox there. They're not truly separate if there really are laws that govern their interactions. So most people who try to come up with pictures of reality, I think these days argue for kind of monist, reality as a whole, echoing what I mentioned earlier, instead of dualistic worldviews. And you could there are people who argue only the physical world exists, consciousness is some kind of illusion. This audience, I think rightfully, probably doesn't entertain the idea that consciousness isn't real. You have idealism, the idea only mind exists, matter is some kind of image in consciousness. There are other, panpsychism is an idea these days that's getting a lot of attention. The idea that matter and mind are both kind of inherently part of all of reality. And my proclivities are more, I think mind is emergent. I think matter comes first, but I don't think it kind of makes mind any less real. I think it's an absolutely kind of real part of our world. Okay, so how are we going to make sense of these experiences? You could say, I'm assuming you could take the dualistic view, but I don't think we're going to get anywhere with that. I don't see modern psychology and neuroscience fitting with that. You could take the idealistic view that maybe, I think the best non-physicalist explanations of this comes from thinking about idealism, the idea that maybe this is like some kind of dream, and because matter is some appearance within that dream, then weird stuff can happen. That's, mind isn't actually constrained by matter. So it's not really that you leave your body during a near-death experience in a dualistic way. It's more that it's all consciousness and you have the appearance of a body which isn't really that real. That's more sophisticated, I think, than dualism, but I still, the seeming dependence of experience on physical structure, like, if you take out my eyes, I'm pretty sure I'm not going to have visual consciousness anymore. These very, very simple things kind of utterly convince me that the direction of causality is that matter comes first and consciousness is dependent on matter. Okay, so if we're going to try and make sense of these experiences from the perspective of contemporary neuroscience, if you think about, I mentioned before, perception, some of you might remember a few years ago, this kind of destroyed the internet, this dress that people couldn't agree if it was blue or black or white and gold. We won't do it now, but some of you will see this as one, some as the other, and these are the kind of filtered versions. And it points to this fundamental truth that I was getting at earlier, that kind of experiences, sensory qualities, whatever you want to call these experiences, they don't genuinely exist out there in the world. The world doesn't have an appearance. Appearances are things that appear in the minds of organisms like ourselves. And so we can disagree. We can have different maps of this world. So perception, some people think of as a kind of controlled hallucination that is, as I mentioned with evolution, it's useful for our survival, but we're not really seeing an objective reality. There is something out there, but our consciousness doesn't reflect it accurately. And it wouldn't be possible to reflect it accurately because it doesn't have an appearance. Okay, so I mentioned at the start this way of thinking about perception and categorization, forming of concepts as being this extraction of certain patterns by networks of neurons. And I mentioned that if you run this process backwards, you can effectively extract the patterns, these statistical features, by training a network, getting it to learn, just by changing its connections between these different neurons. And in a simulation, if you then basically get it to generate, get it to kind of dream or hallucinate what patterns are stored, that's how you get these kinds of images. But you can also get it to hallucinate, and you see patterns that are strikingly similar to psychedelic experiences. So this is very much like a kind of low-dose LSD experience of very fluid forms, the kind of statistical patterns that we see in nature. You see lots of natural curves. You don't see lots of kind of rigid right angles and hard lines. And so if you train a brain or a neural network on naturalistic forms and then get it to show you what it's learned, it will show you more naturalistic forms. So this is the kind of cornerstone of how I think about visionary experience, that this is striking to me. If we're not thinking about this the right way, then I don't know how to explain this. You know, to me, it seems like, okay, we've really got a handle now on roughly how perception works, as kind of building up these models in networks of neurons. We've got an idea of how they can generate these patterns, they can kind of hallucinate them. So at this point, you know, this is my kind of launching off point for saying that I don't think visionary experiences should be taken as literally true, you know, as literally kind of evidence of other realms or other entities, as a lot of people attempted to do. But yeah, that I think they do reveal important things, but they're important things that are to do with our own programming rather than objective literal truths about the world. And I should say again, for anyone who's who thinks, yeah, again, like why is he thinking hallucinations could be real? There's this feature of these experiences that people often call ontological shock, the feeling that they now feel that reality is more real than this reality and not really knowing which way is up. There was a recent paper that came out from Roland Griffiths where they kind of quantified as part of it people's ratings of how real the DMT experience is. And on average, it was rated to be about 50% more real than the kind of consciousness, the everyday waking consciousness you're having now, assuming you're not tripping. Or, you know, another way of saying that is this experience feels about 2/3 as real as the DMT experience, which to me feels about a similar ratio to dreaming. When I'm in a dream, it feels completely real. When I wake up, I think it was above 50% maybe, but you know, intuitively it's like it wasn't quite as real as this world. And so if you have an experience of waking up from this world, you know, you can wake up from a dream and go, oh, I was dreaming. You know, why did I not realize I was dreaming? But then you can have, it turns out you can have an experience of waking up from this reality into another experiential reality. And philosophically, you have a genuine problem there. No matter how much science you do, you can never fully, you know, disprove to yourself that you're not going to wake up into that reality a second from now, in the same way you can't prove you're not dreaming right now. So just to remember that there are reasons to spend time thinking about, the idea that visionary experiences might be real in some sense. So you can do these kinds of back to these kinds of artificial neural networks. You can generate your own kind of versions of these. Here's what I did, and essentially you see it's been trained on lots of natural images, and so it throws up the kind of patterns. The thing I find interesting is the way that you can see the impression of a kind of horizon. There's like some kind of gradient of the floor that isn't in the original, but the neural network is kind of imposed, and almost maybe buildings or something back here. As you crank up the kind of hallucination level, you get very psychedelic images, very saturated with color, as you might expect if you're kind of throwing up the core patterns that you've extracted from the world. Lots of natural patterns. You're not seeing geometric skyscraper-y type things. You're seeing, I mean, this very much depends on what you train the network on. But yeah, we evolved to see natural images, so it makes sense you would see these kinds of fluid melting natural images. Eyes as well. This is, I'm not sure how they train this network, but this goes to show, you know, I was mentioning earlier that you see a lot of eyes in psychedelic art. Eyes are incredibly biologically relevant to us, and you can get these networks to generate these kinds of visionary images as well as landscapes and places. So in ayahuasca in particular, people will go to places, landscapes that they feel are so vivid and real that there's no way it can be generated by your brain, but it's important to remember that this experience feels very vivid and real, even though it's a kind of controlled hallucination. You know, the job of consciousness is to kind of generate a seemingly real reality. So we know it has that capacity. This is some artwork by Pablo Amaringo, who's an ayahuasca shaman who paints these wonderful paintings. I just felt like this had some kind of similarities, his visions, to these kinds of things generated by these neural networks. Okay, so just to kind of, as an example of using this perspective to account for visionary experiences, the eyes I mentioned earlier, these are two artworks by Alex Gray. This was actually the cover for the DMT Rick Strassman book. Again, lots of eyes here as well. And if you take a visionary experience to be literally real, then you have to, you'd have to think, well, is there a realm with loads of eyes? Why is that? And also, these are human eyes. These are not just eyes. These are the eyes of a very specific primate, the one that we happen to be. Most other primates, you don't see the white of the eyes, but it's generally kind of thought that we evolved this kind of change in the geometry of the eye because we're a highly social species and we do a lot of mind reading. Right now I'm kind of trying to make sure I'm speaking in a way that people are vaguely entertained. And if you were there in person, I would see if people's eyes were darting around in a way that made them look bored. If someone's going to steal your food, you want to be able to kind of mind read and see where they're looking. So this is a very human feature, and a perceptual feature, something you need to be able to perceive, and babies can perceive from birth. They seem to, or at least behaviorally, they track eyes from birth. And we can do these eye tracking experiments that have been done. You can have a picture of a face, and this is actually from an adult, not from a baby, but you see these are hotspots from where the tracking data goes. You can see where the kind of eyes dart around. And so babies don't just look in random places. They have this real program template to lock onto eyes. And more than that, they react physiologically to different emotional faces. They can discriminate different emotions, and even imitate emotions as well. This is from a classic study. And so as these kinds of creatures that evolve to survive, we're highly sensitive, especially when we're born, to these cues from caregivers. We need to be able to coordinate with them, and our nervous systems are wired to be incredibly sensitive to being nurtured and being relaxed on the one hand, versus even small levels of emotional neglect can lead to radical changes in kind of physiology and the state of the nervous system. So I see the presence of eyes in these artworks as evidence for us triggering something in our kind of deeply rooted programming that's being manifested through this kind of understanding of perception that I outlined earlier. So the core kind of argument is that with this understanding of how we build up models of the world through perception, you can use that to think about the mystical experience as basically when you hold on to your categories less tightly, you hold on to your perceptions less tightly, they get more creative, things start to kind of meld, and then you can get insights into deeper kind of structures in reality that you wouldn't usually be aware of when you're living in your kind of slightly deluded, structured feeling of the world being structured into objects in the mystical experience. And in the visionary experience, when you crank up the dose of certain substances or use particularly biologically appropriate or resonant substances like DMT, you trigger kind of hyper modeling state where you decouple your kind of perception from the sensory input that's coming in and go into overdrive of just showing basically what the content is that's kind of there programmed in the mind. And I guess I should also say that people really feel like these experiences don't come from them. And I think that's true. I think they come from parts of the mind, parts of the organism that have been crafted over evolution. It's a kind of computational picture of kind of Jungian archetypes, you could say, where we have these kind of programs in us. And with the mystical experience, you see that the self is really just a thought. It's just one part of the mind. And these experiences are not coming from the self. They're not coming from that part of the mind that tells stories about who you are. So they really are, coming from outside of your psychological self. They're coming from your organism, or maybe even more appropriately, they're coming from the history of your organism through this pattern through time. And so I think people's felt sense of this is not a trivial hallucination, a projection of my individual mind is true. And you could even describe it as being passed down from their ancestors and live, kind of species memory is another way you can think about this. So I think these visionary experiences are deeply valuable, very, they can really show you stuff about what we are and what's important to us. But I don't think the neatest way to understand them is as literally showing us anything about the nature of reality or consciousness. But as a scientist, I don't want to just, you know, that's the perspective that aligns with the mainstream. I don't want to just basically say, you're a kook if you don't agree with me, we should do science. And so there are people who are interested in running experiments where people stay in the DMT state for long periods of time so that they can test the seeming autonomy of these entities. They can ask them, try and get information that they couldn't know, that the subject couldn't know, see if people can come back, with corresponding information across participants, a whole bunch of things. And we should be open to, paradigm shifts come along fairly often that radically change our understanding of reality. So I'm not going to say people shouldn't do these these experiments, but yeah, I'm sure I think you can sign up online if you want to become a kind of a psychonaut, exploring these new continents of the mind. Actually, ancient rather than new. But that's a different point. So I think I probably just said this already. Mystical experience shows reality is unitive. That is a genuine insight into the nature of reality. It shows consciousness is not a property of the self, but I think we need science to decide on the place of consciousness in the natural world. And I don't think visionary experience should be taken as literally, as evidence of dualism, as evidence that this consciousness can leave the physical body. But I do think it can be used to get a deep understanding of why they are therapeutic, why they can provide insight into what we are in our kind of deepest essence. Okay, and that's it. Thanks for listening.
Amazing. Thanks so much for that, James.
Thanks for sharing. Great. Thank you for showing me.
Yes. So there's one question so far. If anyone has any questions for James, it would be great if you could type those in. So first off, we have Jussi from Finland. James and Jussi, I don't know if you know each other yet. If not, it's a pleasure to connect you here. Jussi, I'll try and unmute you now.
Sure. Hello. Can you hear me?
Hi.
Thank you for the talk. It was excellent.
Thank you.
I found lots of ideas that were almost identical to my own. I have been working mainly on consciousness, neuroscience perspective combined with sort of Brazilian monism perspective. But my question to you is about the heart problem. I don't really like the term at all because I don't think it's the problem at all. Instead, I would say it's the human condition. It's distinctness between this organism and those organisms there. It stems from the fact that because you are distinct from me, I can merely represent you in my own mind. And that's the reason for the epistemic gap. So it's gap between me and you. And it's always relative to perspective. But I was wondering, because in psychedelic experiences, it seems that you become aware of your representations or experiences as experiences. So that when I see the computer, I can be aware of my seeing the computer as an experience and not just as something external, an object. So if you take this attitude to neural models of consciousness, for example, models of neural correlates of consciousness, could you reduce the heart problem or the epistemic gap to the distinctness between the experience itself as a concrete thing, something existing in its own right, and the model that is based on observations of the experience in the neuroscientist, and how the neuroscientist models all the fMRI images and the EEG data and so on. It's only conceptual models of something out there, like the hidden cause. That's the experience. In your case, you could confirm it, but you get the idea. What do you think about this?
Yeah, in keeping with what you said about my ideas being very close to yours, I feel like I think something very similar, different enough that it's this would be a good thing to explore maybe at length in another conversation as well. So yeah, tell me if this is a similar idea. The way that I see the kind of the emergence of the heart problem in the kind of individual mind is as a kind of a gap between concepts, models of the world that are always kind of, as you build them, they're fading into the past, and then immediate experience that's happening right now. And so I think this is similar to what you were saying of being like, well, how you could say those concepts are of other people or of the world. But I just said everything, all of your concepts, and there's this gap between I'm thinking this, I'm coming up with ideas, I'm modeling, but there's this experience. And no matter what I think, no matter what I model, I can never the snake can never bite its tail, and it never like gets solved. Until you have these spiritual experiences. So, and psychedelic experiences, which, as you say, is you turn experience on itself. And that's how you close the gap. I'm not talking here about a scientific theory, but if you want to feel like you've kind of grokked the connection between reality and consciousness, and you've really intuitively got it, in my mind, these do come in these states of wordless, kind of meditative experience of experience. And so there you lose this, I think because we're these survival machines that are always pushing ourselves into the future, that's why we have this kind of anxious modeling difference between the kind of model and the new experience. But then when you stop and you have a moment of true just being, then there is no heart problem. We are here, experience is really happening. And this isn't something I've spoken about in public because I've been afraid that it will sound quite rude to a lot of people who study consciousness. But I think a lot of us who end up studying this stuff comes out of a certain existential anxiety. It comes out of this feeling of, I want to think the right thoughts that will make me feel that existence is okay. And you can't do that. You can't think the right thoughts and then go, I've said the magic formula, and now I can sit back and be enlightened and happy. That's not how it works. You need to, enlightenment states are ones of experience. And so I think for some people, there's an emotional block to really getting where consciousness exists and why it exists, because you need to engage on this kind of, this level in which experience turns on itself. Does that sound vaguely similar?
Yeah, I recognize a lot about that. Exactly. Scientific modeling or representation is only one of many kinds of modeling, and you are talking about brute experience and like this, a bit like the Zen state of consciousness, like just being without reflecting on the being.
I should say, I guess I see Western philosophy as an extension of that anxious thinking in the individual. So it's like, I would say you have kind of Buddhist philosophy to me is more profound. And then if you don't engage on that and you let yourself go down the chain of thinking, you're suddenly now very much removed from experience. And then you get natural philosophy, which becomes science, and all of these models are extensions of the anxious ruminations of individuals. And so there really is, you're talking about, your question was about scientific modeling, and I'm basically saying I completely agree, and I'm tying it to the experience of the individual organism. Our science, our philosophy, it's all just people, organisms trying to feel okay in the universe. And so I see all of these models, as you say, as well, I see them as in the way that you laid out, this gap between the concept and the experience, in the way that I was arguing as a kind of inherently to do with our own actual survival and our own emotional states.
Yes,
that's really interesting you mentioned that, James. Like it just kind of teased something out of me when you described like all sorts of aspects of the Western posture, the Western standpoint to these things, and people desperately wanting that security, like desperately wanting whatever it is that will just make me feel okay, which relates to, I think, a distinction between these unitive mystical experiences and the kind of visionary ones. So just during your talk, I was just kind of anecdotally thinking about different people who've had each types of these experiences, and it seems there is something more secure or attractive to the Western mind in the visionary experiences, like, because not so much for their mystical unitive experiences, but when you've met ayahuasca, when you've met God, it's much more often that they get things like, stop eating meat, call your mother, this is what you need to do. But you'll have people that have these mystical experiences where they realize, like this gulf between myself and the universe ceases to exist. I am but a pattern, and I can't help but deviate from that pattern. And it's coupled with the same sort of, this is it, this is something really important. But then after the excitement of that's died down, you realize, well, what's the value of this? Like, it doesn't make me a better person. Like, it doesn't change anything for me, because there's still this really deep sense I'm after something that's going to make everything okay now. Really interesting.
Yeah. Yeah. I think to chip on that, I think the mystical experience, is one where you can't put it into words. It's not really a model of the world. It's just here everything is. Whereas I think our kind of conscious models of the world are always serving a function of survival, which can be more broadly understood as just feeling okay in the world, emotional health, all these things. And so when you see it that way, if you have any ideas about the world, it's likely they're serving some function, some emotional function for you, whether that's that you believe in a God, or you believe that Mother Ayahuasca exists, or you believe that this physical room exists exactly as it appears to me now. All of these are kind of consoling stories we tell ourselves, and reality itself is really beyond words,
So next up we have Marco. If you want to unmute yourself and ask your question, Marco Fabs.
Hi, cool. Thanks for your talk. That was great. Thank you for joining us this evening. So what I'm wondering is basically the follow. So in your theory, it seemed that, let me see if I can get this right, that the important thing was the interaction of the organism and sort of reality as a whole, which gives rise to experience or subjective consciousness. And so what I'm wondering is where you see that boundary to be. So, that be self-replicating robots, computers, or, maybe some complex crystals, or is it a lot higher than that? And if you think that this is a question for science, then how could we ever sort of, from a third person perspective, independently verify the presence of experience in this stuff other than what we directly experience ourselves? Hope that makes sense.
Right. That's a great question. And it may be a bit of a dry answer. So the initial intuition can be one of, with a cell, it makes sense that's a bounded system that's interacting with an environment. It has a membrane, that's fairly straightforward. You could say something similar about our skin, but even then it gets a bit blurry. And for me, there's a vast body of work that's now been done by a neuroscientist called Carl Friston, who I mentioned in the talk, who worked with Robin Carl Harris on his rebus theory of psychedelic states. And he's just done wonderful work, really incredibly detailed work, mapping out exactly what the statistical properties of boundaries in living systems are. There's a statistical term called Markov blankets that he uses. I effectively appeal to that literature, and to some extent defer to people who work in statistical physics and thermodynamics. That is not my training. It's above my pay grade to pretend that I'm going to be the one to crack the thermodynamic issues of which boundaries are relevant. But conceptually, in that work, the key to me is that the kind of boundary he describes, a Markov blanket, is one in which a system maintains its form through having some parts of its boundary sense the environment and other parts act in the environment. So, we do that clearly. We have muscles that can move us and we have sense organs, but single cells do it as well. And if you just look at the operation of that system, it performs inference. The mathematics of what's called Bayesian inference falls out of it. And this is well known now. This is kind of core of Carl Friston's work. But I'm arguing that is a real key to saying, why should it be that I, as a living system, can believe things about the world? I can hold these intentional states about the world, whereas a rock can't, because a rock doesn't even have a meaningful boundary in that sense. But I think going forward, there'll be very interesting questions about if people, find this perspective useful, very interesting questions about which neural systems are different bounded systems, because I personally believe that it makes sense to think of different systems within us that we think of as unconscious as just being differently conscious and inaccessible. You know, evolutionarily, we're kind of cobbled together from a whole bunch of different organisms. You know, we even have different kind of kingdoms of organisms within us, like bacterial cells that are part of us. So it makes sense to me to think of us as these weird Frankenstein creatures that are have multiple minds. Yeah, but the actual kind of nitty gritty is going to be kind of borne out over time with classic science, basically. Oh, but also you mentioned there is unfortunately no way to experimentally test the presence of consciousness. It's going to be a theoretical thing where you look at it in the same way of natural selection. You kind of look at it and go, well, natural selection, you can kind of do experiments, but it will ultimately come down to being like, okay, this makes sense. Like for me with the visionary state stuff, the presence of eyes, you know, of human eyes in those states, to me, I'm like, okay, like this is a hallmark of something generated by the human mind. And to me, like, it just feels like I can't see any other explanation. And you can never experimentally test whether that's true, but in the sense that there isn't a kind of disincarnate, disembodied world. But I'm happy to kind of stop my questioning there, and it will be that kind of thing, unfortunately.
Okay, Kenneth greedily asked two, but because we all like Kenneth, you can ask both.
Thank you so much, James, for the talk. Yeah, so I had two questions, as Eddie was saying. The first was, and I think you sort of already addressed this in your answer to Marco's question. You mentioned briefly this idea of the living process, living mirror theory of consciousness that you had come up with. And my question is, what do you see as the difference between consciousness and a mirror? Is it just this process of active inference whereby the brain is generating a model of the world? And the second question was, you mentioned this idea that consciousness is not a thing, but this sort of like continuous process of self-modification that's mediated by the interaction between self and the world. And if that's the case, then does it make sense to localize consciousness in a body, or how can we even like draw the boundaries around consciousness if we see it as this sort of like interactive process rather than a thing that is located in a specific place and time? Yeah.
Yeah, so I would definitely, to answer your second question first, I think that's a fascinating point that you can't say consciousness is even in the organism, because if you take the organism outside the environment, there is no consciousness. You know, it seems trivial to say if you put me in a vacuum, I won't be conscious, but as a living system, it's actually highly relevant. I really need my environment to have consciousness be a phenomenon that exists. And I find other emergent phenomena like running to be a useful example here. You know, if I'm running and you say, where is the running? It seems it's in my organism. You could say it's in my legs, but it's in the entire dynamics of the process. And it's even in the, you actually need to kind of zoom out and have the earth with gravity. You need the whole planet to be in your picture to really understand what running is. You know, you can't run in space. Again, it might sound trivial, but so it's this strange thing where you get these phenomena that we're so used to things being localized in space that it seems weird to say it's kind of over there. There's an island of it over there in the vicinity of that organism, but it just doesn't have a spatial location. And much like with a lot of, you know, physics in the 20th century, I think that's just something weird we have to swallow. And you know, the universe is under no obligation for things to kind of make intuitive sense in that way. And your first point about, yeah, like what is it about life? What, you know, is it different to a mirror? It's obviously, you know, a mirror is an analogy because it appeals to exactly what we've just been talking about in your second question, which is that if you look at just the brain or just the organism to understand consciousness, you're not going to be able to. If you just look at the surface of a mirror and you want to understand the image in it, you're not going to be able to. You need to look at the room, the photons, the patterns, even the objects that's coming off from here before. And so it's a loose analogy to say that consciousness exists in this coupled, you know, emergent thing of life in a context. So, you know, think of like life like a whirlpool. You know, we're these Ilya Prigogine, the kind of Nobel Prize winning chemist, came up with this idea of dissipative structures where you keep your order together because you funnel energy through you, and it's your structure that actually allows you to kind of get order out of the chaos. And whirlpools are those kinds of structures, and so are we, but we have different dynamics. And so a whirlpool wouldn't be conscious because it doesn't have the kind of sensory action, active inference dynamics going on that we do have. And yeah, I think the one hindrance, I think, well, what I see in the literature tends to be a perspective of, you have these conscious brains, and how are we, you know, I mean, there are people who think about embodied cognition, but they tend to think about a conscious brain embodied in a body and embodied in an environment. And they're saying, well, how do we work backwards from here? I'm saying you have a universe, consciousness emerges in it. Where can we see, where does it emerge? And then you see whirlpools in the universe that are us. And from that's a fundamentally different perspective, where you never even need to say there is a separate organism. It's truly just a pattern in the universe. And, you know, this is where you can get into these kind of fun, more flowery ideas of like, we're like eyes opening in the universe becoming aware of itself, kind of Alan Watts quote, which I do think is, yeah, a reasonable thing to say.
All right, Matt Rowley asked a question both in the Facebook group and in the Zoom chat, but it's too interesting a question for now, so I'm just going to jump and read one over from Facebook. So from Susan Hopkinson, thanks for this, very informative. Do you think the visionary experience is similar among those who take DMT or ayahuasca because of unconscious expectations or cultural influences? Also, have you explored Vedanta in your search for understanding consciousness?
Yeah, maybe I'll get into a habit of doing second question first, because yeah, so Advaita Vedanta, you know, is Advaita meaning not to in Sanskrit, and so Vedanta, kind of end of the Vedas, where these texts that describe a very similar worldview. The bits I've read, so there's something funny that I think happens when, you know, with psychedelic experiences and also with really reading these texts, is they can tend to confirm your own worldview. To me, they seem to be saying, there are some traditions that are quite literal about only mind existing and only consciousness existing. To me, when I read the Vedas, they're like, the main emphasis is on the non-conceptual, the fact that categories don't exist, that, you know, reality is beyond words. But in modern Western kind of Hindu spirituality, there seems to be a very strong like people equating non-duality, Advaita Vedanta, with idealism, basically saying, you know, in the text it's like, reality is beyond words, you know, you could never put a name on it. And then in modern kind of dialogues, it's like, yeah, but let's call it consciousness. And I'm like, well, yeah, but, you know, it's like the Tao that cannot be named is, you know, like, remember that? I mean, that's a different tradition, but it's the same point. It's like, we should really be sitting with, it's okay that we can't name it. So yeah, that's my take on Advaita Vedanta. And the first question, I'm now going to forget, because it was a great question, but it was unrelated to the Vedas, which I've now.
Do you think the visionary experience among those who take DMT and ayahuasca is similar because of unconscious expectations or cultural influences?
My short answer is a categorical no, in the most part, I would say. And that mainly comes from my own experience. So when I first tried the pure DMT experience, I'd listened to a talk at Conference Breaking Convention by Dennis McKenna, where he'd said that he thought that DMT might be what he called a neurotransmitter for the Gaian brain, which is a wonderful hippie-ish idea that I absolutely love. And is the idea, you know, the science of life that I'm kind of basing my ideas in does hold that the kind of Gaia hypothesis that the whole of the ecosystem is a self-regulating, self-sustaining system, but it's not got the same kind of boundary that would give it the kind of active inference properties that you need for consciousness in my theory. So, but I was interested in this. I was like, well, maybe there are, you know, maybe nature communicates to us. You know, I was thinking nature is conscious in my theory. Maybe it communicates to us in ways that are currently outside of our scientific conception of the world. And so I tried DMT thinking, okay, I'm going to do this self-experiment, and I expect what's going to happen is I'm going to see kind of naturalistic fractals, and but I'll feel like there's some message behind it, some intelligence. So that's what I was expecting. And I tried it and was immediately on a kind of gurney on my back with about 8 aliens around me, examining my body and telepathically communicating with me, which is a very common DMT experience that I'd not read about at that point. And as someone who has no interest, has had, you know, no interest in kind of UFO or alien abduction phenomena, this did not feel like some expectation or something that was rattling around in my brain. and the experience just happened and was gone, and felt very, very strange. And what I took away from it was like, oh, okay, these abduction phenomena, again, are a genuine feature of the human brain. I think there are explanations. I tend to think of this in terms of birth programming. You know, people have thought about whether they could be memories of being in hospital. I have a kind of slightly different take on that, but that's the way I tend to think about it. But no, I mean, it very much feels like you're unearthing stuff that's in there. And when you see the artwork, like the artwork I showed is astoundingly similar to my experiences. Yet, you know, I hadn't seen them before, and I had to do a lot of digging to find the kind of people who are willing to depict it in its weirdness. You know, I may have seen some of the more spiritual kind of depictions, but yeah, it's gives you chills when you have these experiences, and then you see someone's drawn exactly the same thing almost. But almost certainly, the human mind is capable of yeah, using whatever you've already experienced. Like my first ayahuasca session, the first visual I had was of an extremely vivid kind of serpent coming over my shoulder. And I felt this recognition of like, okay, that's Mother Ayahuasca in serpent form. I now look back on that and think, I probably just thought that because everyone had said you see Mother Ayahuasca. And so I just like called it, you know, so that's something where I would say, yeah, I saw a serpent, probably was, you know, who knows what even I meant by that in that moment on my third cup of ayahuasca, whatever it was. So yeah, a mix of the two, I guess, is a more full answer.
Okay, I was going to unmute Matt, but who somehow managed to write a question in the Zoom chat, but is not in the Zoom chat. How? So Matt would like to know if you have any insight into the relationship between psychedelic use and, he specifies, long-term interoceptive sensitivity.
So
you can answer for short-term as well if you like.
Yeah, I would say definitely that there's a strong association. For me, again, unfortunately, for a lot of this stuff, you have to appeal to your own experience. So it can't be that. Yeah, can't just point to scientific evidence. But for me, yeah, it radically changed my my kind of embodied emotional intelligence. You know, going from feeling like a passenger in my body, and if my body was if I had, so the concept of a physical problem is something I don't really have much anymore. Like I obviously do if I like hurt my leg or something, but I would say before psychedelics, I might, you know, say my stomach is playing up and it's a physical problem, or my skin is, you know, like itchy and it's a physical problem that I don't, you know, it's probably coming from something physical like the dryness of the air or something. Now I see all of that as being reflective of kind of stress processes that you're kind of, that you can sit on and kind of dissociate from and just like repress a bit. And naturally for me, it produces, I think, altered states by breaking down your narratives. They kind of, because living systems are self-propagating, self-organizing, self-regulating systems, you kind of blow yourself, you know, blow apart your narratives. And then when the pieces come back together, you're naturally, it's a healthful process. It's a process of self-organization. And so, you know, if I went from saying I just had an upset stomach to having a psychedelic experience, I would most likely come down with some not, you know, expectation of, or some feeling of, oh, okay, that's actually low-level anxiety because this thing in the distant future. And once you have a psychedelic experience and you feel the feeling, you see the memory very vivid, or the thought very vividly, it produces this tendency towards wholeness, you know, which is why Stan Grof coined this term holotropic, meaning kind of moving towards wholeness for these states, which I think is a useful way of thinking about it.
I think these questions about somatosensation and interoception, if it weren't for how exciting all the brain stuff and how exciting all the visionary stuff was, like if it weren't for that, there'd be so much excitement about what's going on with psychedelics on that. So I keep coming back to the fact that so many ayahuasca ceremonies can be seen to just play out bodily, like with no visionary experience whatsoever. But also, this is anecdotal, I have no data on this. So if you watch psychedelic conferences, and you watch people describe their own experiences, there's distinct differences in how natal men and natal women describe it. Like, it seems to me like there's a greater preponderance of women describing and kind of gesticulating in more embodied terms. And so my question is really, so there are 5-HT2A receptors in the brain, but like 90% of your serotonin receptors are distributed, say, in your gut or elsewhere in your body. And don't quote me on it, but I think there's also gender differential distributions of like the expression of these receptors. So I think Matt's question is really good, and it's a super interesting question, but unfortunately we've got the most interesting questions in science that have just pipped it to the post.
And also it can be uncomfortable. It can trigger people's own emotions. A very embodied thing, and especially in male-dominated kind of areas, there can be a tendency to err on the side of shutting down these things and not people feeling uncomfortable thinking about it. So, even though it's incredibly valuable, people's own issues can get in the way, I think.
Yeah, very plausibly that could just be an artifact of socialization process. Yes, Jussi, please do ask a stupid question.
Thank you. Yeah, I was afraid it's too stupid, but you emphasized the unity aspect of the psychedelic experience. And could you elaborate what you mean by unity here?
Right. Yeah, so I would say the core idea would be one of, I think of reality as a process, as something where it's made of interrelationships rather than truly separate objects. And the nature of any particular thing in that framework, in that process, is defined by its interrelationships. So I was actually talking to Eddie just before about this, about Fritjof Capra, who is a kind of intellectual hero of mine who I interviewed recently and just released yesterday a conversation with him. He wrote a book called The Tao of Physics, basically saying how modern kind of understanding of subatomic particles, it makes sense to think of them as points in a holistic system where everything is defined only by its relationships. They're just a network of interrelationships. And the same thing is true for life forms. An evolved organism is nothing more than the manifestation of the possibility of life in that niche. Like, you can't have a bird without the atmosphere, without plants, without the sun. So it's this picture of, and this also shows, I'm glad you raised this, because it's not a kind of unity where it's like, oh, only my mind, only consciousness exists, therefore we're just in one consciousness. It's more saying there is no separation, there is no fundamental division. Everything is tied together in this interdependent web. So it's like, I guess if you were a single strand of a spider web, you might focus on your difference to the other strands, but then the equivalent of this experience would be to see the web and go, oh, okay, the primary thing is there's the web. And I evolved to be really preoccupied with my relative separateness, the fact that I am relatively different to you, but that's a kind of felt to be a secondary phenomenon that's quite a kind of parochial concern. It's like, it's not really of that importance objectively. It's only a little kind of evolved and limiting thing, and it produces suffering. So that's partly why I think people are ready to discard it and say, this isn't as real as the unity.
I totally agree about the interconnectedness aspect, but I think it's a bit different from unity. I get what you mean, but the stupid question would have been that if everything is united, how come I cannot feel your feelings or think your thoughts? Because it sounds, you said that there is no sort of, I'm not sure, I might be like misinterpreting you, but that there are no real boundaries, but it seems like a really real boundary between you and me. When this Zoom ends, your thoughts are your only, and I cannot have any access to it. So the difference between organisms, but I'm misconceiving something now.
So that's a really good point, and is important for me because just because so what I'm saying is there's a holistic perspective, and we mentioned Advaita earlier and the concept of non-duality and the wisdom of calling and that's the same perspective, I would say, the wisdom of calling it non-duality is to avoid the conversation we're having now of getting hung up on definitions of unity, because you can't capture it in a word, really. You could say it's oneness or unity or something like that, and it points towards it. But if you say things are not fundamentally separate, like split in a fundamental way, things can be distant. They can be causally. I mean, you say we're separate, but like I was going to say, you know, we're physically distant, but we're influencing each other profoundly right now. We're a coupled system. You know, I'm responding directly to these sound waves that are being channeled to me. So really, there is this interdependent whole. But yeah, I mean, I use the word unitive because in, you know, the mystical experience is what it's often been called because mystics have spoken about it in the past. Science has often liked to call it the unitive experience because it has less associations of perhaps, yeah, they don't want to be associated with spiritual stuff as much. But I think you're right, and it's not something I'd actually thought about before, that to be united does have the feeling that you're pointing towards, that we should somehow be collapsing into each other. Like everything should be genuinely, yeah, like at a kind of singularity point if it's truly united. So yeah, I think that's
because it's sort of levels. There are levels of being, and when there are two people disagreeing about politics, for example, there is some highly complex, like low entropy system there, that like high information content that's like contradicting each, not compatible. But then you have the lower baseline level of being that is shared, because we are all made of atoms. It's all the same stuff ultimately. Different forms of the same stuff. It reminds of something like hylomorphism, where the substance is the same, but the forms are different. And somehow, if we can reach that substance, we see the unity.
right. Yeah, I mean, and I would say that that aspect of reaching it is why meditation and experiential states are important, because, you know, it's these states are pretty much defined as being inexpressible. You can't communicate in words fully the actual perspective, and that's because words are concepts. They are to do with differentiation, separation. So, you know, we can talk about these things and we can say things that get towards it, but you're never, it's what we spoke about earlier with the snake biting its tail of experience in the model. You're never going to be able to, you know, we're never going to be able to close that gap and really kind of get it unless you just kind of stop back and you just stop and sit back and experience. Yeah, and I think as people coming from a Western tradition, it can be hard to remember that and truly be okay with that. The rational mind really wants to kind of pin it down fully. But if you can live in both of those things and oscillate between them, I think that's it's good to, yeah, to be comfortable with the ineffable side of this, I guess.
All right, James, I hope you did a bit of cheeky neuroanatomy revision before you started, because we've got an interesting neuroscience question from Andy.
Eddie, can you hear me?
Perfect, loud and clear.
Thank you, James. Thank you so much. This was a fascinating presentation, and I'm a filmmaker, so I'm not an academic, but I am making a film about ayahuasca, and it's how Eddie and I met. Just like to ask you a little bit more about how does the colostrum communicate with other brain regions, and how might that affect an ayahuasca experience in the context of understanding the ultimate puzzle of consciousness?
Yeah, that's it. I may disappoint you with the answer because I think it's highly speculative. But yeah, so the colostrum is this densely kind of interconnected area in the brain that it kind of, you know, brain scans, it kind of lights up for a bunch of different functions. And as a result, people have speculated that it may be crucial for kind of, yeah, the consciousness associated with the human brain. I'm not, so when I showed earlier the map of kind of 5-HT2A receptors that psychedelics act on, they are known to be densely expressed in the visual cortex, which is maybe not surprising that you have visual experiences. They're known to be densely expressed in what's called the default mode network, which is associated with mind wandering and then the way we kind of weave together our narrative self. I don't know off the top of my head if they are particularly densely expressed in the colostrum, or if any other relevant receptors like sigma-1 would be. Yes, but it's an interesting avenue to go down. I would say intellectually, but I haven't got any pearls of wisdom on any connections there for you, unfortunately.
Okay, I need to do some research. Thank you,
know where you
James.
find it.
Great
All
talk.
right, that appears to be the end of the questions. So I don't know about the rest of you, but I just had the most lovely time for the last 2 hours or so. So thank you very much, James. For those of you that managed to make it all the way through the end, I am duty bound to push some other events. So we have 3 workshops coming up, 2 artistic workshops online over Zoom, and 1 food and medicine mushroom foraging workshop that is out there in 3 dimensions. So if you're interested in any of those, make sure you're following us on Facebook and joining the group as well. We have 2 more talks later on in this term. In a couple of weeks' time, we have one on psychedelics and Spinoza. And in 8th week, because it's always a crowd pleaser, we have DMT and the near-death experience, courtesy of Pascal Michael at Imperial College. Before I say goodbye once more with the begging bowl, if you're here still, that means you've had 2 hours of enriching entertainment from us, and that's got to be worth £2. And Rain, if you will put the PayPal link in the chat once again. Wonderful. Thank you so much, James. Thank you everyone for showing up, asking great questions. We'll see you all soon.